Now today we will discuss John Milton's Paradise Lost. I think many of you must have also read it earlier in your graduation level, or even some portion of the Paradise Lost is prescribed in many of the syllabuses in undergraduate studies. And I think it is not a very um, strange thing that students of English literature are not acquainted with Paradise Lost. Anyway, I don't know whether it was in your syllabus in your graduation course or not, but we are including here. And as far as I'm concerned, I've been told that we will be reading book one and two, but as some of you had suggested, now for this time we are going to discuss only the book one, and from next academic session, both book one and two will be read together. And I think earlier we were reading both the books, book one and two, because it always go together. Paradise Lost is a long poem. It has got more than 10,000 lines. It is one of the finest epics that the world has produced so far, and undoubtedly this is the best literary epic of English literature. John Milton is regarded as a great poet only because of this great poem Paradise Lost, and a sequel to Paradise Lost he wrote afterwards, and it is a shorter poem compared to Paradise Lost, and that is known as Paradise Regained. So it is a biblical theme, as many of you are aware. If you are students of English literature, you must get some exposure to the Bible, and it is a very nice poem. This is, as many critics have agreed, that this is the best epic in English literature and one of the best, and it can bear comparison with Homer's Iliad, Odyssey. I think you have heard of Homer's great epic Odyssey and the Iliad. They are also prescribed in your syllabus. I don't know whether you have done it or not. And then there are many epics in Roman literature. In Italian literature, we have got another great epic written by the Italian poet Virgil. Have you heard it? Aeneid. The title of the great epic is called Aeneid. So this Paradise Lost was written in the uh, what we say, uh, in line with uh, Aeneid. Aeneid is a great Roman epic, and he also imitated from Iliad, from Odyssey, and perhaps he might have gone through Dante's Divine Comedy, and that is also another great epic of the medieval period. Of course, Aeneid was written some years before the birth of Christ, and then in 14th century, another great Italian poet, Dante Alighieri, he wrote a great epic, a literary epic. It is known as Divine Comedy, and Milton knew the language, Italian language well, and he could read and he could write, and he knew Italian well. Therefore, he went even to Italy. Therefore, perhaps he might have got acquainted with all these things, and he was a great, say, master of language, and he was his education was good. He went to Cambridge, and he got a lot of ideas. And Milton, if we have to remember Milton as a man, then his involvement in politics during his time, he lived in the 17th century. Of course, I will give you a very brief introduction on the life of Milton. And he was a great political activist, and he wrote many political pamphlets, and his ideas, for some time, he was regarded as a great Commonwealth leader. By that time, England was ruled by a Commonwealth, and English Parliament, it was more or less replaced by that Commonwealth, and there was no king, isn't it? And the king was killed, and then that period is a brief period where England was ruled by Oliver Cromwell, and that rule is known as rule of Commonwealth. But in course of time, it did not last long. Then uh, Charles II came to the throne in England, so it was again restored. the period where great, social and the political turmoil happened in Britain, and moreover, 17th century, as many of you might have understood, is an age of the Puritan uprising in England. England, the Puritanism is a kind of movement, started against the authority of the Pope, and so it started as a religious movement, but gradually Puritanism became a social and a political movement. And then in the 17th century, the whole of England was, overwhelmed by this puritanical movement, and it became a very powerful political movement. That's why, the king was king, and he was dethroned, and he was even killed and beheaded, and then it was ruled by a Commonwealth. So he lived in that terrible period, Milton, and by the time when he wrote this poem, he became completely blind. See, his eyesight from the very beginning it was deteriorating, and then by the time when this Paradise Lost was published, then his eyesight was lost, and then the second edition, the second volume of Paradise Lost, of which we are going to study, it was published in 1674. The first edition was published in 65, and there, it contained only 10 volumes, 10 chapters, and the total length of line is about 10,000. But in the second and the revised edition, which he brought after some years, he divided the same text into 12 parts. Earlier it was having 10 chapters, and then now he, made it 12, and he added some stories. In the beginning of every chapter, and those stories are known as his arguments. And he also made some minor corrections, modifications, amendments, etc. Therefore, now at the moment we are depending mainly on the second edition of the poem, which was done in 1674, and he died in 1674 also. So he was born in 1608, 1608, just at the beginning of the 17th century, and then he continued to live for up to 1674, for more than 60 years, nearly 70 years he lived, and this Paradise Lost is one of his, later publications. And after Paradise Lost, he wrote only two things, the two works, that is Paradise Regained and the Samson Agonistes. Samson Agonistes is again based on some other, say, mythology. Greek mythology about Samson, and then who had been deceived by Delilah, and he was a very strong man, etc. And that myth he dramatized as. So he wrote many besides political pamphlets and all those booklets regarding essays. Then he wrote these things, and one of his earlier poems, which he wrote when he was in Cambridge, is known as Lycidas, and he wrote another play, Camus also. So Lycidas, I think some of you might have read this. I don't know how many of you have read Lycidas. And there, the pattern, if you have gone through Lycidas, then it will be easier for you to understand Paradise Lost. But Paradise Lost is not a very easy poem. By all standards, it is not an easy poem. But then, as we do not have much time, we cannot discuss it elaborately. Therefore, you have to take this poem seriously if you want to learn it. And if you think Paradise Lost is an easy poem, then there is something wrong with you. This is not my opinion. Many experts, many professors on Milton, they said that Paradise Lost, at the first reading, when we are, confronted with this problem, with this poem for the first time, then there should be some sort of difficulty and confusion. And if you do not get that confusion and the difficulty, then something is wrong with you. That's the opinion given by many professors. Anyway, please do not take it seriously, but take it in the sense that it is not an easy poem, and it requires your devotion, because this poem was written in grand scale. The style that Milton followed in this poem is known as grand style, and the language that he uses, it is simply grand. It is simply superb from all aspects, this poem, and it was written in blank verse. I think many of you have heard about the blank verse. I told you earlier that blank verse was mainly used in drama by Shakespeare, Marlowe, and the other dramatists of the Elizabethan age. And the Milton came a bit later. Elizabethan period, it happened in the 16th century, and it was followed by Milton. So Milton is, simply a poet belonging to the Renaissance. If the proper period of Renaissance that appeared into England from 15th and 16th centuries, then there is some sort of say a continuation of the feelings of Renaissance. Say, for example, it is often said that Spenser is the first flower of Renaissance. Then Spenser came in the 15th century. By 15th century, Renaissance came to England, and the impact can be felt in Spenser. And then in 16th century, Shakespeare came, and then in 17th century, Milton came. So Spenser is the first flower of Renaissance, Shakespeare is the second flower, and the last flower is Milton. Why I'm telling you all these things is that it will be easier for you if you understand in that way. So there are three flowers of Renaissance in England. First is Spenser in 15th century, and in 16th century it is Shakespeare, and then in 17th century it is Milton. So these three poets can be clubbed together, and they can be called as the flowers of Renaissance. This is how it would be easier for you to remember. And don't take it in the literal sense. Simply is a technique of remembering all these points. So therefore, he wrote all those things. So let me tell you very briefly, before we start reading the actual Paradise Lost, something about the life of John Milton and his activities. It will serve as a brief literary background. So 17th century, as I told you earlier, is a century with full of activities, and it is a great century where we find so many uprisings and so many upheavals and so many agitations, movements, and they have got long-lasting effects. England, as we know today, even is a Protestant country. You know, there are different denominations of Christianity in the world, and England was converted to Christianity by the 9th century AD. So by the time when Milton wrote this poem, he had already he was a Christian, and England had already been converted to Christianity, and he was born in London. First, let me come to the life of Milton, and he was born to a well-to-do family, and his father was a lawyer, was a scriptwriter, was a real estate agent, anything that is known as scribe manager. Therefore, he came from a well-to-do, not very rich, but middle class, just above average, and he went to Cambridge and Christ College, Cambridge, and that is one of the best colleges. Even today, and during those days also, it was a very good college, and there he, wrote Lycidas, the great poem which I just told you. It it was written by Milton when he was not even 30 years of age, and it was written as an elegy, just to lament the death of one of his friends, Edward King, and who died of drowning in the sea. And that was a very nice poem. And after going through that poem, then you can understand how deep Milton's knowledge of the epic. You know, epic, as we all know, is a great poem. I think whether I have told you earlier or not, epic is a long narrative poem, and the subject matter of epic usually is uh, patriotism, heroism, or something very uh, gigantic, very powerful, and very popular themes. Petty theme, it is called grand theme. So you cannot write an epic when two cats are fighting, quarreling. Say, for example, Alexander Pope wrote The Rape of the Lock. It is a mock heroic epic. So he was simply, it was a satire. So the lock is a piece of hair from a lady that was cut, and that battle, mock Alexander Pope wrote like an epic, then it becomes more heroic. It becomes, even though the form and everything seems to be that of epic, we cannot call it epic because the subject matter is very low, subject matter is trifling, and for a very small and a trifling subject matter, you cannot write an epic. You have to write an epic on a very gigantic, powerful, and grand subject matter. And say, for example, Homer's Odyssey, Iliad, the theme is about the Trojan War. It is a mythological history where the whole nation is involved and the beauty of the Hellene, then etc. And then Aeneid, which Milton, copied only in structure, Aeneid also an epic, and just it is a continuation of the Trojan War. Homer wrote a very, very beautiful account of the Trojan War, isn't it? Uh, in Iliad and the Odyssey. Then one of the heroes of Troy, Aeneid, he ran from Troy because Troy, the city of Troy, it was completely annihilated by the Greeks and it was burned down. Then some of the heroes were killed, and Aeneid is one who escaped the great calamity of the Troy, and he ran away. And there he went to Italy, and there he Rome, and then he started the Roman Empire. So this is a very grand theme. So the theme is very big, and it was imposing. So this should be the subject matter of epic. Even though we all know that epic is a long narrative poem, the theme of epic should be, a very always grand. There should be some sort of magnanimity in the theme or subject matter of epic. This is very important. So you mentioned all the epics. For example, Dante's Divine Comedy, of which I just mentioned, is also about a visit of to the hell, and it is also a Christian epic. And Milton perhaps was influenced to some extent by this epic also. And actually, there are so many stories. Paradise Lost was written a long time ago in the 17th century. So many, many centuries after this poem, many scholars have already, discussed exhaustively all the pros and cons of this poem. Therefore, there will be no dearth of reading material on Paradise Lost. Only thing is that your attention is required. So even if I may not mention all those details because it will not be possible for me to discuss all the details, but then it is quite clear that Milton was, trying, say, to choose a subject, to select a topic worthy of writing an epic. And ultimately, he was thinking to write a heroic teaching because many of the epics, many of the grand narratives, they are concerned with patriotism, they are concerned with heroic say, activities of certain protagonists. For example, Hercules, Samson, etc. These are great heroes. So Trojan War, we find Achilles. So many great heroes. So he was thinking to write that story of bravery, story of courage, story of the great heroes. But ultimately, he left everything and he decided to choose a topic. This topic is something bigger than all those heroic heroes because it concerns the cosmic, it is universal, and it concerns with the philosophy of the whole Christian world. It is the fall of paradise, isn't it? This is the loss of paradise. As the title suggests, Paradise Lost, the theme deals with man's first sin of disobedience. The opening line of the poem says that of man's first sin of disobedience. That is how Milton opens this line, this theme. So the theme contains there, it is the disobedience. And the theme is the creation of man, and then the fall of paradise, the loss of Eden gardens. This is the theme. So this is universal theme, and this is the biggest theme so far anyone has conceived to write an epic in this manner. Therefore, we can ultimately choose to write an epic on this theme, and it was a great success. Right from the very beginning, it became a very, you know, well-known poem and a very say discussed poem, and now everybody agrees, says that this is the best poem, the best epic in English literature. How beautiful is English language? We can understand when we go through the pages of Paradise Lost. The style, the diction, language that a poet uses in poetry is called poetic diction, and the diction, that poetic diction that we find in Paradise Lost, this is the best diction. This is the best example of the best quality English language. See, so it is superb in many aspects. Therefore, that's why I ask you all to read it very carefully, and please read it again and again. And the book one is only very short. The whole poem contains 12 books, as I have already told you. The first edition contained only 10 books, and now these 10 books were, rearranged into 12 books, and some additions, some amendments were made. Therefore, this final version of the 1674 edition is regarded to be the true version, and it has got 10,000 lines. And obviously, 10,000 for book one, as we are concerned with book one, only book one is a very short book. This is the opening chapter or opening book of Paradise Lost, and it is comparatively short. Short in the sense that the number of lines in Paradise Lost, book one, is less than 800. It is not very short. It contains about 800 lines. Anyway, but compared to the whole length of the poem, it is not a very big volume. Anyway, this is very important volume, book one, and here you will find the introduction of the theme, and then the preparation by the group of the fallen angels led by Satan. Satan was Lucifer. Satan was earlier an angel, and he was one of the brightest angels that God had in heaven. Then somehow he revolted against God, and then he was, driven away from heaven by God, and then he started his kingdom in a place called Tartarus. Tartarus is nothing but hell. I-double-E-L. No, I-E-double-L, hell. Hell, hell means inferno. It is a kind of a place, where all these fallen angels are there, and it is burning, and it is not a very good hell. In Dante's Divine Comedy, hell is inferno. And the first book of the Divine Comedy deals with Inferno, the sins in Inferno, and there are many concentric circles in Inferno, and all the sinners are condemned there, and they are put there, and according to the severity of the sin that they committed when they were living in the world, then punishments were given to them. So it's a very nice story. I don't know whether that Inferno, Divine Comedy Inferno, is there in your syllabus or not. Anyway, so this topic, this subject matter of the epic fall of man is the actual, topic. And the why did man fall from heaven is because of the sin. Christianity, as you should know, Christianity is concerned with sin only. It is the Christian belief that we are all sinners. We commit sin when we are living on this earth, isn't it, in this world? And so long as I'm doing something, some activities that may be good, it may be bad, something be moral or immoral, anything I do, it must have, some say consequences. And if I do bad things, then I'll be getting sin, so I'll become a sinner, and that's how I get a lot of sin. The another Christian belief is that we get sin as a legacy from our ancestors. For example, the sins committed by my father, by my parents, are given to me. So something that belonged to my parents after their death, it comes to me naturally. And similarly, the sins that committed my parents, they are also handed down to me. So our sins were handed down from generation to generation. My father got the sin as legacy from his predecessor, from my grandfather from their grandfather. That's how series of sins we have been getting as legacy. So all these sins were handed down to us from say generation to generation. And if all these sins are piled up, then it will be just like a big mountain, you know. And then again, when I'm living in this world, I'm also committing certain sins. I cannot avoid sins. Therefore, already I have got a large stockpile of sins, and then again I'm also committing a lot of sins, and all these sins I'll be simply handed down. I'll give it to my children as a legacy, and they will be getting it, and then they will be committing. Therefore, we are all sinners. This is the very concept of Christianity. The philosophy of Christianity simply says that we are all sinners, and that the first sin was committed by our great 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 grandfather Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve, as you know, is the first man and woman created by God, and they have committed the first sin of disobedience. They were after their creation, God, you know, allowed them to live in paradise. Paradise is just like heaven. It is God's own creation. Man is God's most favorite creation. Therefore, you know, God created the Garden of Eden in paradise. This Garden of Eden is simply paradise, and they call it paradise. Paradise is just like heaven, and synonymously now in our common parlance, we use paradise and heaven synonymously. Therefore, I know Adam and Eve, our great great great, the first men, human beings on earth, they were living in the Garden of Eden, and they were innocent, and they were provided with all the qualities of virtue, and they were very beautiful. That's how, you know, it was simply heaven, and that is the favorite creation of man, God, and the God's finest creation is man. Then all those fallen angels led by Lucifer, they were revolting against God. And in the war that followed, they could not defeat God. Therefore, they were again driven away from God, and they were put into the hell. And then in the hell, they had a meeting, a great meeting. And the capital of hell is called Pandemonium. In the common parlance, Pandemonium means chaos, disorder, and a very noisy place. When there are a lot of people discussing themselves something, and when nothing comes in order, that is called pandemonium. But that is the origin of the word pandemonium, is that pandemonium was the capital of hell. It was in pandemonium that Satan ruled as a king. Therefore, when they discussed the matter of their war against God, you know, as they could not wage war against God, because God was more powerful, far, far more powerful than those fallen angels. Therefore, they decided to destroy the finest creation of God, that is man. That was their plan. So by destroying God's favorite creation, they would be waging war against God, and they could not directly confront God. Therefore, they were trying to, you know, seduce Adam and Eve to become sinners, and then accordingly God will give punishment to Adam and Eve. That is how, you know, they wanted to take their revenge against God for driving them away from hell. So this is the story, this is the subject matter. Then ultimately the first sin of disobedience was committed by Adam and Eve, then they were driven away from paradise. So at the end of the book 12 of Paradise Lost, then you will find that Adam and Eve being led away by the angels to some other place, because after committing that sin they became extremely repentant. Therefore, there was once, you know, assurance given to them that only the Son of God who volunteered himself to die for the sins committed by them. Therefore, the Son of God is none but Jesus Christ. Therefore, it was Jesus Christ who, you know, sacrificed his life for our sins. This is the Christian belief. I'm just telling about the Christian belief system. Therefore, until the arrival of Jesus Christ, then there would be suffering. Therefore, if we pray to God, we have to pray to Jesus Christ who sacrificed his life for our sins, and so that our sins can be redeemed. So this is the Christian belief. So Milton was a believer in Christianity. But the controversy arises whether Milton was really a Christian or a true Christian or not. There are many critics who simply say that Milton was an atheist. He did not believe in God, and that there are some reasons for it. But for the time being, don't think that he was an atheist. He was purely a Christian. For that matter, I have to tell you something about this movement of Puritanism. I'm a bit confusing because some ideas are jumbled up. If you find any difficulty, then please tell me. I will give you an explanation to suffer. In 17th century, a religious movement came up in Britain, and that movement is known as Puritanism. So Puritanism was a religious movement. So Puritanism simply said that uh, the authority of Pope. Pope was ruling. He was the king of the Christian empire. There is a hierarchy in the Christian religious uh, say, administration, and the Pope is the Pope is on the top, and there are some archbishops, bishops, priests, etc. There are certain names, and the Pope sits at the Vatican City. Pope lives in Rome, in Vatican City. Vatican City is the center of Roman Catholicism, and that denomination of Christianity, which is ruled by Pope, is known as Roman Catholics because Pope no, rules from Rome. So Vatican City is in Rome, and from that this Roman Catholicism appeared, and these bishops and the popes and the Roman Catholics, they were spreading Christianity to different countries of Europe. That's how England was converted to Christianity. Therefore, England became first converted to Roman Catholicism, and the Pope became the supreme authority on religious matter. But then the Englishmen, they did not like the authority of Pope. They were against the, because for even simple thing they have to consult the Pope, and they have to wait the directives of the Pope. Pope were in a far away place. Pope was in Vatican, and whereas they have to wait the instructions from Pope time and again. When any difficulty arises, when some sort of clarification is needed, then they have to consult the Pope, and the directive of the Pope should be final. Therefore, but the Pope lives not in England; he lives in far away place called Rome. Therefore, these people did not like. Therefore, the Puritans, they thought that if God is our Father, we are also children of God, and the God is very kind. Therefore, even if we commit our sins, then we may pray to God, and then if we are pure in our heart, and if we are pure in our mind, if we do not indulge in immoral activities, isn't it? And if we say do penance, in a penance for our bad things, and then we may be forgiven by God. And why should we take the help of another priest who is at the other place, not in England? And whether Pope is not the private secretary of the God, if we have to go to the God, shall I take the permission from the Pope? Just like the minister. When we want to meet a minister, then we have to take permission from the private secretary first. We cannot go directly into the chamber of the minister. Similarly, if we have to make our prayer, why should we pass through the Pope? Pope as the private secretary to God, as the authority to God. Therefore, we can also make our own prayer. So that is the idea behind this movement of Puritanism. So they were protesting against the authority of the Rome Pope. So this movement against the authority, becomes political in nature. Even though it started as a religious movement, why the movement of Puritanism was a political movement? You can understand it. Puritanism started as a religious movement, and the moving philosophy of the movement was that why should we obey the authority of the Pope? Pope is not above us. Only God is there, and the Pope, as well as we laymen, we are also serving God. Pope is also serving God. And then why should we go through Pope again and again for our prayer? So we can make our prayer provided we are pure in our heart, pure in our thoughts, pure in our actions. That's why the name Puritanism. Therefore, they were insisting a lot of emphasis on purity of mind, action, thought, etc. So they call themselves Puritans because they consider that so long as we remain pure and not contaminated, then we have every right to pray to God, and the Pope is not necessary. But that was, in effect, a revolt against the authority. And the revolt against authority is political in nature. Politics is nothing but it is a power, a game of power. Therefore, if we try to overthrow something, then it is political in nature. Therefore, the spirit of movement of Puritanism was religious, but then the performance, the activities that they were doing, it was political in nature. That's why, even though it started as a religious movement, Puritanism soon, became a very powerful social and a political movement. Then there was political unrest. Then, when it was translated into politics, the king was the source of power because the king was ruling. The king was by that time the king was the absolute monarch. Therefore, the king, that movement against authority, when it was translated into a political movement, it was directed against the king. Naturally, the king became a despot, and then people simply try to exercise their free will. So, free will is a word. Don't forget this word free will in connection with Milton. Whether you find it in your book or not, try always to remember this word free will. So, Milton was a great advocate of free will. So he supported this movement of Puritanism and the movement of this Protestantism. They were protesting against the authority of Rome. That's why Rome. That's why again another name Protestant. So England is even today a Protestant country. But Puritanism, some Puritanists, even though they are Protestants, there are some differences also. Let me not go into all those details. But Puritanism, they were extreme in nature. There are very bad sides of Puritanism also that we will discuss later on if time permits. But then, so a revolt against the authority became a revolt against the king. That's why the king Charles I, he was Charles the First, he was driven out of the country and he was killed, and his son reigned to Spain. And then England was ruled by a Commonwealth, and the leader of the Commonwealth was Oliver Cromwell. So Milton supported Oliver Cromwell in principle, of course, and not only in principle, he was one of the prominent, say, what should I say, ministers, not ministers, secretaries, they call them secretaries, and he was drafting all the important papers of Cromwell. So all the political pamphlets advocating free will, advocating, the say right of the individual human beings to do freely whatever he wants, etc. All these things were written by Milton, and he was deeply committed to those ideas. So he was, a great revolutionary in that sense. So he was revolting against the existing norms and the existing hierarchy of Christianity. That's why some scholars would like to call him an atheist. But actually, he was not an atheist. He was a Puritan poet. His spirit was Puritanism. So he is one of the finest examples of Puritanism. So he was a Puritan poet, a Christian poet, and of course the theme of Paradise Lost, as we have discussed, is concerned with the stories of the Bible. The first book of the Bible is called Genesis, isn't it? And in Genesis you will find the creation myth, which were the story of creation of the Bible, how Adam and Eve were created by God, and how God created this universe. As we all know, God created this universe in a week, in 7 days, and on the last day He created this His favorite creation, mankind, and then He took one day's rest, Sabbath, etc. That is how you find the creation of the universe in Genesis. So this story, the subject matter of this poem, was taken from the Genesis of the Bible, and Milton deal with it. And then, as I told you earlier, in the first book you will find, I will simply narrate the story of the first book of this uh, poem. It was simply the revolt, the preparation of the revolt by Satan in the first book. And these long lines, about 800 lines, more than 700 lines, 790 or something like that. I cannot actually remember the number of lines, but it is very long. And all these lines are dedicated to the discussion in the pandemonium, in the great chamber hall, in the great parliament of Hell, isn't it? Pandemonium was the capital of the Hell, and it is also known as Tartarus. Tartarus is a pre-Christian name. It came from the Greek mythology, fall of the Titans. The Titans, after the Greek, these are pre-Christian gods in Greek mythology, class of Titans, but you must have heard. And after the war of the Titans, they were put into a region in the netherworld where burning, and that place is known as Tartarus. And the Tartarus is equivalent to modern day hell, or you may call it Inferno, hell, or Tartarus, anything, but they were living in Tartarus. And taking a cue from that Tartarus, Milton created his Pandemonium. Pandemonium is the capital of the hell, and there is a parliament in Pandemonium. There are so many fallen angels like Beelzebub, like there are so many names. All these names you will come across in book one, and that they were discussing the revolt against God. They had been driven away, for they had already revolted against God, and the God defeated them, and the God have thrown out of all of them out of heaven, and they were now living in Pandemonium, in hell, and in hell they constructed a Pandemonium, the capital city. It was a very nice parliament. So book one is devoted to the discussion of all these ideas and how they should take revenge on God, etc. Thus, they can take revenge on God by destroying God's finest creation, that is mankind. That is how the theme is concerned. So this is the story. Now, coming to Milton's life, as I told you earlier, he was, no, right from his very beginning, he had that genius of writing poems. He wrote Lycidas, etc., when even before he reached 30. And then he was, to some extent, influenced by Fairy Queen. Fairy Queen is also another great long poem written by Edmund Spenser. Edmund Spenser, I told you just now, he is the first flower of Renaissance. So he was inspired to a great extent by the story of Fairy Queen, then Homer's Iliad, Odyssey, then Virgil's Aeneid, etc. And then by 1642, let me be very brief, he married one Mary Powell. Mary Powell, in 1642, he married Mary Powell, and during this period, he wrote his Lycidas, and then when King Charles the First was beheaded, he wrote, he expressed his views that bad kings, tyrants must be killed. So he supported the movement of Puritanism, he supported the movement of Commonwealth, and he was speaking in Parliament that the Parliament had every right, to go against the will. By that time, English Parliament had already been there. Don't think that, but the only thing is that now the British Parliament that we see today is quite different from the British Parliament that existed during the days of Milton. The Parliament was there, but the Parliament was not so powerful as the King, because the King was there, he was the absolute monarch, and he was ruling, and the Parliament simply tried to help him. That was the nature of Parliament. But Milton wanted that Parliament should have the power even to overthrow the King. And even today, that tradition is followed. Now, the king's power has been reduced greatly in Britain. Of course, the monarch is there in Britain. Now, the king of Britain is Queen Elizabeth. King means the monarch, the absolute monarch. So she is a queen, a monarch on namesake only, and she is not actively participating in the administration of the country. Of course, she remains simply a titular head. Similarly, but previously the king was very powerful. Therefore, Milton expressed his opinion that the Parliament had every right to go against decision of the king, and the free will should be exercised, and he supported the Commonwealth, and then that is how he started his career. And he published many Christian doctrines in connection with his movement against the authority of Pope. Also, see all these different trains collectively, then you will get a pattern on this Paradise Lost and a pattern how Milton wrote all these things. So he was revolting against the authority, number one, and as I told you earlier, that directed his attention from Pope to the king. So he was going against the king, against the absolute monarch, and he was very active writing all those Christian doctrines, all those political doctrines, and then uh, unfortunately during this period when he became very active, by 1651 his eyesight became very weak, and by 1651 he was completely blind, and before that his eyesight was gradually weakening, and he was completely blind in 1651, and by this time he lost his wife died, and his son also died. Therefore, personally he suffered a loss, a great loss, and the death of his wife and his son and himself becoming a blind, it was something terrible, quite terrible. But Milton was active and he was actually fighting for it. So 1 year after the loss of his wife and death, then he, was suffering greatly. But he made another second marriage, and he was married to Catherine Woodcock. First wife was Mary Powell, and now the second wife is Catherine Woodcock. And the Catherine Woodcock, he was married to Catherine Woodcock in 1656, and then after 2 years, when Milton became completely blind, and he was not only blind in eyesight but also blinded with his ideologies. Earlier, he was having high sounding of ideology ideals, and he was fighting for it, and he was even challenging the king. And now, physically, he was losing his eyesight. He was becoming poor, and his family was in shambles. And moreover, then unable to bear all those different movements, because the rule of Oliver Cromwell became a kind of a dictatorship, which was quite, opposite to what Milton had already conceived. Therefore, he became disillusioned. And during the after 2 years, then simply Catherine Woodcock left Milton. Therefore, Milton's second wife gone, and then in 1663 he married his third wife, Elizabeth Mincel. Elizabeth Mincel was, the third and the last wife of Milton, and she was married to Milton in 1663. And then by that time, when after her after his third marriage, Milton started to write his Paradise Lost, and it is generally believed that writing Paradise Lost started somewhere in 1665, and then now after it took about 1 or 2 years, then it was first published in 1667. And as I told you earlier, the first publication of Paradise Lost, it was having 10 volumes only. And that the same text, he changed it, and then he published in 1674 another complete volume, another Paradise Lost having 12 books. The first book was having 10 books, then in the enlarged, not actually enlarged, it was in the modified, it was having 12 books. So this is the brief history. So from what I have just told you, now we must try to develop the idea that Milton was a revolt. Say Milton joined the revolutionary movement. Of course, for the time being, let us call it revolutionary movement, because he was going against the tradition, and he was quite enthusiastic in the beginning, very beginning. But after some time, Oliver Cromwell's rule, the rule of Commonwealth. I told you earlier, England was ruled by Commonwealth, and that rule is called Commonwealth. British Parliament was abolished. There was no Parliament, so instead of Parliament, England was ruled by a Commonwealth, and the head of the Commonwealth was Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell was a great dictator, and he killed many people. And Milton, like many others, even though supported the movement earlier, became disillusioned later on. And that is how he died. So by 1674, when he died, Milton died very peacefully, and by that time, the second, then restoration took place. So this story, if we have to see in the context of Paradise Lost, you can find that Paradise Lost, the theme of Paradise Lost is just like that. God was ruling, God was the all-powerful, almighty, all-powerful, the creator of this universe, the creation. And then those fallen angels, just like Milton and his friends, these fallen angels led by Lucifer, they became very powerful, and they knew all the ways of the God, and they were so close to the God. They knew the powers, that God enjoyed. Therefore, they became envious of those powers of the God. And Lucifer was one of the most glorious and the finest followers, finest angel. Angels served God, and they were serving God as angels. But Lucifer was the leader of the angels, and he was the most powerful. He was the finest, and he was the wisest of all of them all. So he was second to God. Therefore, he wanted to usurp God's position. That's why he started revolt against God. But Almighty God, is something above us, and all these, even they have got some powers. They are no match to God. Therefore, God punished them, and God had thrown them out of the heaven, and that's how their revolution was fail. It was a failure. It ended in catastrophe, failure, and they were creating hell and the pandemonium in hell. And in this pandemonium, in this parliament, just like Commonwealth or British Parliament, they were discussing how to defeat God, and ultimately they took the decision that they cannot openly confront God, because it would be certain death, because under any circumstances they can never defeat God. But the only thing they can do is that if they destroy God's finest and the most favorite creation, mankind, then they would be taking the revenge. That is how they plan their revolt. So book one of Paradise Lost is confined to the strategy, confined to the lectures, and confined to the discussion how they should revolt against God. And Satan says that it is better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. Of course, that you will find in book two. The exact line you will find in book two. That's why I told you earlier, book one and two should always go together. So book one and two is devoted to the preparation of war against God, and then the temptation of Eve. So this is how we have to understand uh, the poem. And again, uh, book one's synopsis, I will read it later on. And the poem opens with, I think all of you have got Paradise Lost. Do you have Paradise Lost in front of you?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Uh, I will read it. It begins with the line, of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death unto the world, and all our woe with loss of Eden, till one greater man, this one greater man is Jesus Christ, restore us and regain the blissful seat. So this is the theme, the very theme of Paradise Lost is there in these opening lines. You must read the opening paragraph up to say first 30 lines of the poem very carefully read it again and again, so that you may, you know, bear it in your mind. So you have to read it, and there are so many annotated texts. Therefore, it will not be very difficult for you to read. Therefore, the theme of this first disobedience and the man's disobedience and the consequent loss of paradise and the revolt of Satan. these are the three parallel themes that you will find in this poem. So then redemption of man, that is the Son of Man, the one till one greater man. This greater man is none but Jesus Christ. Therefore, it never mentions the name of Christ, but this greater man is there. And in the opening, you will find, after going through a few lines, you will find the evocation to the muse. In writing epic poetry, it was the tradition of epic poetry, epic poets, to make a prayer to the muse. And Milton in Lycidas also, he made the muse first, that is a prayer. So in all epic poems, in Odyssey, in say Divine Comedy, in Aeneid, in many of the epic poems, you will find the invocation to the muse. Muse is the poetic, it is the goddess of the spirit of poetry. So the poet who is going to write a great poem should first make a prayer to the goddess of poetry, or to the muse of poetry. That is simply called muse, the spirit of poetry. And the poem begins with that prayer. And he's simply describing the theme, and it will continue for some time. Then he will make the invocation as he did in Lycidas also. And
Getting this laptop.
that is the tradition, and this tradition Milton actually followed, and he was following the classical tradition. I think all of you have understood the difference between classical and romantic tradition. So Milton was a classicist, so this he was writing this poem in the classical tradition, and then this subject matter was introduced, then proper invocation was done, and then ultimately now the story becomes. And if you read history, then you will find in Ten Commandments, at the time of Moses getting the Ten Commandments from God, he was referring to he was standing on a place called Mount Sinai. That reference will be there. So Milton is simply trying to, bring those biblical histories, those creation myth and of Moses in this invocation that you will find. And then the prime cause of man's fall is Satan. It is because of the temptation given by Satan to Eve, and then after convincing it first to eat the forbidden fruit, that forbidden fruit, I do not know whether it is an apple or not, that is not very important here, because in the Garden of Eden, it was a very nice garden, it was just in paradise, and the paradise was created just as heaven. The abode of gods is heaven, therefore man cannot live in the kingdom of gods, in the abode of gods. Therefore, God created another equivalent place to heaven, and that it is paradise. So it was so nice. It was just like heaven, and the beautiful garden was there, and that it is called the Garden of Eden. And the God asked Adam and Eve to live in that beautiful garden. And then in the middle of the garden, there was a tree that is called the tree of knowledge. Tree of knowledge is the apple tree, or what kind of tree, we don't know. And there are so many fruits on the trees, and the fruits just like apple, because of course now we come to the conclusion that it is apple, maybe apple or not, but they call it the tree of knowledge. And Adam and Eve, they could eat anything. There are so many fruits, and God provided, their food. But then God asked them not to pluck any fruit from that forbidden tree and to eat them. They cannot eat them. It was forbidden, because that would be, that is not allowed. That was forbidden to them. Then Satan, gave the first temptation to eat, and then Eve ate the fruit, and then after eating the fruit herself, then she also asked, Adam to eat it. Adam did not like to eat. Adam was an innocent man. Adam did not like to disobey God, but out of love of Eve, then he also ate it. Therefore, he could not even swallow it properly, because he did not like it. He did not like something, that Eve was doing. But as he loved Eve very much, he was simply obeying her, and he could not even swallow it. That's why in our this thorax, what do you call? There is a place he cannot swallow completely swallow it. Therefore, there is some sort of a protruding here in our neck, and that is called Adam's apple display, because Adam could not swallow it completely. That's how we know Adam. Then, after eating the forbidden fruit, both Adam and Eve committed the sin of disobedience, isn't it? And then similarly, they were thrown out of paradise. So, in this Paradise Lost, Book 1, you will see Satan is seen just after he and his fellow rebel angels have been hurled down from the hell into the hell. And the hell is a place of fiery torment. There is no light. And then one of his highest comrade is called Beelzebub. Beelzebub is next to Satan in command. Therefore, Satan and the Beelzebub, they made the fall, and the fall affected them greatly. And even then, in that, very worst predicament, they were, defiantly, say, revolting against God. Their defiance, was still there, and that they suffered loss when, after the fall, when Satan saw his comrade Beelzebub for the first time, he was shocked to find the transformation that Beelzebub underwent during the fall. So they have been, transformed completely, and they have been deformed, and they still they defy the God, and that they refuse to succumb to the pressures of the God, and that they refuse to make prayers, and they refuse to serve God. But then, inside their minds, some sort of despair, some sort of sadness gave a lot of trouble. That is also there. Then Beelzebub asked Satan what they should do against God's all-powerful force, because they knew that God is almighty, therefore God's all-powerful, therefore they what shall they do? They discuss everything, and how to prevent the will of God. Then, as they have been, permitted to damnation eternally, they were simply trying to find certain ways, and there are certain names. I will give you all these names, and one of them was called Moloch, Molocs, Moloch, and this Moloch was also a fallen angel, and after some time, he is included in the pantheon of pagan gods. Pagan gods and the Christian gods are very different. In Rome and in Greece, ancient classical Greece and the classical Rome, you will find many pagan gods. And this Moloch, he became a pagan god later on. And then there are Astrid, Honus, Dragon, Isis, Osiris, Belial, and Malshiva. So these are the names of the god that you will come across when you go through it. And in Pandemonium, they discuss how to defeat God, and then one after another, Mammon, etc. They discuss, and then ultimately they decided to destroy God's own creation, mankind. That is the end of the book 1. So, a brief summary of the book 1 is very simple, but then the language that Milton used is called a grand diction, magnanimous language, and the style is grand style, and everything that Milton does in this poem simply surpasses our judgment. So it is the best epic in English poetry. Therefore, I will take another class today. It is already 11. Therefore, I should take leave of you, and if possible, tomorrow or day after tomorrow, I will take another class. And in the morning and in the evening also, I can take class. So I will talk to Ernest, and I will let you inform through him. Now, for the time being, can we stop here?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. I will do that. Thank you.
안 돼, 전화 안 해야지.